Okay, let's unpack this. This is episode 13, where we explore how clinging to our cultural ego distorts history and why a dose of humility might be humanity's most underrated virtue.
Definitely. We're diving into some fascinating source material today, specifically excerpts from Yuval Noah Harari's book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century.
And at the heart of this chapter is a look at this incredibly common, deeply human tendency we seem to have. The belief that our culture, our group, is somehow the absolute center of the world. You know, the most important thing that ever happened, the main driver of all progress.
That's the core observation, yeah. And our mission in this deep dive, using this source material, is to really unpack that idea.
Okay.
We'll examine the claims different cultures and religions make about their unique historical importance, put those claims up against the historical evidence presented by the author,
Right.
and then see what this reveals about the profound value of humility, both in understanding history and, well, understanding ourselves.
Right. So we're taking this chapter from Harari's book as our guide. It's going to challenge some assumptions, I think.
Definitely offers some surprising facts, yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully give us all a clear perspective. Let's get into it.
So the source kicks off with what the author essentially calls the center of the universe syndrome. The observation is that almost every group believes they are the linchpin of human history, the origin point for all the great ideas and inventions.
It's a really widespread phenomenon he illustrates with examples from, well, all over the globe. You see it in the classical world, with Greeks often seeing their philosophers, their cities like Athens, as the unique source of civilization.
And the source notes the Chinese perspective, too, right? Where history might be seen as truly beginning with figures like the Yellow Emperor or the early Xia and Shang dynasties.
Viewing achievements from elsewhere as simply lesser, pale copies.
Exactly.
Okay. You also have Hindu nativists mentioned, sometimes making pretty dramatic claims that ancient Indian sages invented technologies like airplanes or even nuclear bombs.
Really,
Yeah.
citing specific figures.
Yeah, mentioning people like Maharishi Bhardwaj or referencing descriptions they interpret in texts like the Mahabharata, suggesting things like nuclear weapons.
Wow. And it's not just ancient history or specific cultures?
No, not at all. The source points out that devout Muslims often view history before the Prophet Muhammad as largely irrelevant. The real story centers on the Muslim Ummah afterwards.
And within that,
Well, within that, Turkish, Iranian, or Egyptian nationalists might see their specific nation as the crucial preserver of Islamic purity or glory. That kind of thing.
it seems like everyone wants to be the main character.
He doesn't stop there either. He notes how British, French, German, American, Russian, Japanese, you can count pretty much any nation you like, are often convinced of their own unique, indispensable contribution to humanity's story.
I think the most striking example the source gives is the Aztecs.
Oh, yeah. Believing their ritual sacrifices were literally essential for the sun to rise each morning.
The fate of the entire cosmos resting on them.
It really highlights how extreme this sense of centrality can get. And what's fascinating here is the author's direct assessment. He's very blunt.
What does he say?
He says these claims are, simply put, false. They stem from willful ignorance of history combined with more than a hint of racism.
Willful ignorance. Okay, let's lean into that because the source doesn't just dismiss these claims. It puts them to a historical test, right?
Precisely. The fundamental historical counterargument presented is that none of the religions or nations that exist today were around when the truly foundational achievements of humanity actually occurred.
What kind of achievements are we talking about here? The really big stuff.
Yeah, the absolute milestones that define us as a species and civilization. Humans colonizing the entire planet, domesticating plants and animals, building the first cities, inventing things like writing and money.
Okay, huge shifts.
Monumental shifts, yeah. And they happen thousands, even tens of thousands of years before Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or any modern nation state came into existence.
So when any specific culture or religion claims they invented things like morality, art, spirituality, what does the source say about the timeline for that?
It makes the case really strongly that morality, art, spirituality, creativity, these
Right.
aren't recent cultural inventions. They are universal human abilities.
Embedded in us.
Embedded in our very DNA, yeah. And they originated with our ancestors way back in Stone Age Africa,
Yeah.
long, long before any of these specific cultures or religions emerged.
So to attribute these fundamental universal traits to a recent specific place or time, whether it's ancient Greece or imperial China or wherever,
The author argues is simply crass egotism.
crass egotism. Wow. When you think about the immense timescale of Homo sapiens' presence on Earth, it really does reframe those claims.
It certainly puts our relatively recent cultural and national identities into perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. Now, to really illustrate this point about cultural ego, the author turns to a case study that's personal for him.
Yes, his own people, the Jews. He explains it's more polite to critique your own group, thus he knows this history intimately.
Right. Makes sense.
So he uses Judaism as a detailed example of this universal tendency towards seeing oneself as the center.
And what's the Jewish belief about their own centrality, according to the source? How does he present it?
It's presented as a very strong sense of being the most important thing in the world and a tendency to quickly claim credit for pretty much any human achievement you can imagine.
Which brings us to that rather amusing anecdote he shares about the yoga teacher.
Ah, yes. The teacher in Israel who insisted that yoga was actually invented by Abraham.
Seriously?
Yeah, claiming that basic yoga postures mirrored Hebrew letters Trikonasana like an Aleph to Ladandasana like a Daled.
Okay.
And that Abraham taught these poses as gifts to his concubine sons before sending them east to India, citing a verse from Genesis as proof.
So Abraham, the original yogi, that's quite a stretch, even for yoga pose.
It is. And while that's presented as maybe a fringe example, the source points out that more mainstream Orthodox Jewish beliefs hold that the entire cosmos exists solely for Jewish rabbis studying Scripture.
The entire cosmos.
The whole thing. If they were to stop, the universe itself, including distant galaxies, China, India, everything would be annihilated. This is presented not as metaphor, but as a core article of faith for some.
Wow. And it's not just the ultra-religious.
No, the source suggests even many secular Jews often see their people as central heroes in the story of humanity, the source of morality, spirituality, learning, and so on.
So it's a deep-seated idea.
The author's take is that what they might lack in numbers and real historical influence, they more than make up for in sheer chutzpah. That's the word he uses.
Chutzpah, right.
And he uses this example precisely because, knowing it intimately, he can show how this self-important narrative can be, well, deeply flawed when you look at the broader history.
Okay, so let's look at the author's historical assessment of Judaism's actual role then. He argues it played only a modest role compared to some others.
That's his position, yeah. He sees it as having been largely a tribal creed for much of its history, focused on one small nation in a tiny land, with limited inherent interest in the fate of other peoples. And this naturally limited its global impact.
But it did give rise to Christianity and influence Islam. Those certainly had massive global impacts.
Absolutely, and the source acknowledges this lineage. Hugely important lineage. However, it makes a clear distinction.
Which is?
The credit or the blame for the global actions of Christianity and Islam lies with Christians and Muslims. You can't historically attribute things like, say, the Crusades to Judaism.
Okay.
The source argues Christianity, for instance, is 100% culpable for those. And while Christianity adopted ideas like human equality, the source notes this actually runs counter to traditional Jewish orthodoxy, which, he states, has historically held that Jews are intrinsically superior.
So the impact is more through the descendants who modify the ideas, not necessarily the ancestor group itself on the global stage.
That's the argument. The source uses the analogy of Freud's mother.
Okay.
Essential for Freud's existence and influence, obviously. Well, you wouldn't dedicate a chapter to her in a history of psychoanalysis.
Right, I see the point.
Similarly, Judaism was essential for Christianity, but that doesn't automatically make Judaism centrally important to a history of the entire world. The crucial thing is what the subsequent religion did with the ideas it inherited or adapted.
That analogy really clarifies the point. The source also contrasts the impact of the Old Testament versus the Talmud.
Yes, the Old Testament became globally influential primarily because Christianity adopted it into the Bible, made it part of their sacred text.
But the Talmud?
But the Talmud, which the author says is far more central to Jewish culture itself, and is described as often more thoughtful and compassionate than much of the Old Testament, well, it was rejected by Christianity.
So it remained largely esoteric.
Pretty much, yeah. Outside Jewish communities, it didn't have that same kind of global cultural reach.
And the author gives that thought-provoking challenge. Can you easily name global masterpieces inspired by the Old Testament?
Yeah, Michelangelo's David, Verdi's Nabucco, Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments.
Plenty. Or the New Testament.
Leonardo's Last Supper, Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Even Monty Python's Life of Brian, in a way.
Right. But then he asks, can you name masterpieces inspired by the Talmud?
And for most people outside specific circles, the answer is likely no. It just highlights the difference in broad cultural impact.
And the source points out that Jewish communities, despite spreading globally, didn't play key roles in developing things like
Chinese empires or European exploration, democratic systems, the Industrial Revolution, the big structural shifts.
and lists key inventions like the coin, university, parliament, bank, compass, printing press, steam engine as originating elsewhere in Gentile societies.
Right. So if these fundamental building blocks of modern civilization came from varied sources across the globe, the claim of one specific, relatively recent culture being the central engine becomes much harder to maintain historically.
Okay. Moving on, many people, particularly maybe from Abrahamic faiths, might believe that human ethics and morality essentially began with Abraham or Moses in the Bible. The source addresses this directly.
Yes, it critiques what it calls the three great religions concept for sometimes fostering this idea. The source calls the notion that humans before the Bible lived in some kind of moral vacuum, like a Hobbesian state without any ethics.
Yeah.
A baseless and insolent idea that ignores vast other traditions and just deep human history.
What evidence does the source provide to challenge that? Where did morality come from then?
Well, it starts with the sheer age of human moral codes. Stone Age hunter-gatherer tribes had complex moral systems tens of thousands of years before Abraham lived.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah. Think about the Aboriginal tribes in Australia. They had fully developed ethics when Europeans arrived, despite having never heard of Moses, Jesus, or Muhammad. And the source implies the colonists didn't exactly demonstrate superior morals either.
Right. And perhaps most surprisingly, the source points to the deep evolutionary roots of morality, going back even further.
Exactly. Millions of years back into social mammals. That's where it gets really fascinating.
How so?
The source argues that ethical codes for cooperation evolved in species like wolves, dolphins, and especially chimpanzees, long before humans even existed. It gives examples.
Like what?
Like wolves having rules for fair game during play, or chimpanzees respecting the property rights of weaker group members. An alpha male avoiding a junior female's banana, for instance.
Property rights in chimps. That's amazing.
And acts of altruism and care, too. The source recounts the story of Kidogo, a chimp with a heart condition who was helped and protected by others in his group, including the alpha male.
Wow.
And the famous story of Oscar, the young orphan chimp in Ivory Coast, adopted by Freddie, the alpha male. Freddie made sure Oscar ate, protected him, despite no genetic relation.
That's incredible.
And the source draws a direct parallel here. These 8 behaviors of helping the poor, needy, and fatherless happened millions of years before biblical commandments about widows and orphans.
So the roots of what we call morality are far, far older than any scripture. They're biological almost.
Absolutely. The source then points out that even within the ancient Middle East itself, ethical and legal codes existed long before the biblical prophets.
Before Moses.
Centuries before. Rules like thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal are found in Sumerian, Egyptian, and Babylonian texts. Periodic rest days existed before the Jewish Sabbath.
And Hammurabi's code.
Yeah, the famous Babylonian king Hammurabi's code, 1,000 years before the prophet Amos, explicitly states the gods instructed him to establish justice and prevent the mighty from exploiting the weak. It's right there in the prologue.
And the story of the eloquent peasant from ancient Egypt.
Another powerful text, again predating Moses by centuries, where a poor farmer pleads his case to corrupt officials, laying out this sophisticated moral argument for why officials must uphold justice and defend the weak. It's quite moving, actually.
So many biblical laws weren't exactly new revelations.
No, the source argues they were often adaptations of much older, regionally accepted principles.
And it suggests that sometimes Judaism's unique contribution was actually to narrow them down.
To take these potentially universal principles and make them tribal, applicable primarily, or sometimes solely, to the Jewish people. That's the argument presented.
This tribal aspect is illustrated with some challenging examples from Jewish texts, according to the source.
It brings up interpretations found in the Talmud that suggest a Jewish life is more valuable than a Gentile life, citing specific rules about when the Sabbath can be desecrated to save a life, differentiating between Jews and Gentiles.
Okay.
It also raises the possibility that the famous commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, in Leviticus 19.18, given the context among your people, may have originally applied only to fellow Jews.
I see. And the commandments found in Deuteronomy.
To utterly destroy certain groups, the Canaanite nations, leaving not a single soul alive.
Yeah.
The source highlights this as potentially one of the first recorded instances in history where genocide was mandated as a religious duty.
That's That's a really sobering historical point to consider.
It is. Now, it was later Christianity, in its break from Judaism, that selected some of these ideas and universalized them.
Like Paul's assertion.
Exactly. Paul's assertion that there is neither Jew nor Gentile. You are all one in Christ Jesus. A definite move towards universalism.
But even this wasn't the first universal ethic, as you mentioned earlier, with the evolutionary roots and other philosophies.
Exactly. The source makes that point strongly. It concludes that the Bible is far from being the exclusive font of human morality.
And points to others.
Yeah, pointing out other traditions like Confucius teaching a version of the Golden Rule centuries before Rabbi Hillel, or Buddha Mahavira advocating avoiding harm to any sentient being, including insects. At a time when Judaism still involved animal sacrifice and, according to the source, mandated human extermination in certain contexts. The Bible is presented by the author as a complex text containing troubling attitudes alongside some valuable ethical ideas.
So the claim that the Abrahamic religions somehow invented or solely possess human morality simply doesn't hold up against this historical and biological evidence from the source.
It requires a much broader view of where ethics actually come from. Seems like they're deeply human and even pre-human.
Okay, let's take another claimed contribution often praised. Judaism's role in pioneering monotheism. Is that something the source sees as a unique and positive contribution?
The source is quite critical, even here. First, it notes earlier potential instances of monotheism, like the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten around 1350 BC,
Right.
and suggests the religion of biblical Israel wasn't entirely unique, pointing to similarities with, say, the Moabite god Chemosh, who sounds a lot like Yahweh in some inscriptions.
But the larger question, according to the source, isn't really who was first, but whether monotheism itself was actually a good idea from an ethical standpoint.
That's where the author makes a really strong, provocative claim, arguing monotheism was arguably one of the worst ideas in human history.
Wow, the worst. That's harsh. Why such a strong assessment?
Because, according to the source, it didn't necessarily improve morals, but it significantly increased intolerance. That's the core argument. The argument is that polytheists generally accepted the existence of different gods and rituals for different peoples. They rarely persecuted others, simply for their beliefs. Think ancient Rome before Christianity, mostly.
Okay.
Monotheists, however, with the conviction that their God is the only true God, often felt compelled to demand universal obedience. And this conviction, historically, has led to, well, crusades, jihads, inquisitions, and pervasive religious discrimination.
The comparison the source makes between Emperor Ashoka in India and the later Christian Roman emperors really drives this point home, doesn't it?
It provides a really powerful contrast in approaches to religious diversity. Ashoka, in 3rd century BC India, ruling this vast, diverse empire, issued edicts explicitly promoting tolerance, respecting different doctrines, valuing dialogue between religions. He saw diversity as enriching for everyone.
And the Christian Roman emperors centuries later, what was their approach?
Starting with Constantine, and particularly under rulers like Constantius II and Theodosius, you see a systematic suppression of other religions. Non-Christian temples were closed. Pagan rituals were forbidden under penalty of death, and eventually non-Christian religions were made illegal altogether. This included suppressing ancient traditions like the Olympic Games after over 1,000 years, just because they were seen as infidel heritage.
So the source argues this shift towards intolerance is directly linked to that core monotheist idea, no God but our God.
Yes, that conviction, while maybe fostering intense devotion within the group, tended to encourage bigotry towards outsiders who worship differently or not at all.
It's a challenging perspective on something often seen as a major advancement.
It is. The author even provocatively suggests that perhaps Jews should downplay their role in spreading this dangerous meme, as he calls it, and maybe let others bear the historical blame for its negative consequences.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to a more recent era, the 19th and 20th centuries. Here, the source does acknowledge a significant contribution.
Yes, absolutely.
The extraordinary contribution of Jews to modern science.
This is certainly true, and the source notes the statistics Jews comprising less than 0.2% of the world population, but accounting for around 20% of science Nobel laureates. It's remarkable.
But there's a nuance here.
There is. The source is very careful to frame this as the contribution of individual Jews, not necessarily Judaism as a religion or a traditional culture in itself.
And this success seems linked to a specific historical shift, a change in how Jewish people engaged with the world.
Absolutely. The source argues this scientific flowering happened after Jews largely abandoned traditional religious schooling, the yeshivas, and integrated into the scientific world of their Gentile neighbors, particularly during the major waves of secularization in the 19th and 20th centuries.
So what, if anything, did their cultural background contribute then, if not the religion itself?
The source suggests valuable cultural legacies certainly played a role. Things like deep value placed on education, a strong faith in the power of knowledge, disciplined study habits. Other factors likely included the drive of a historically persecuted minority to prove their worth, and perhaps institutional anti-Semitism, pushing talented individuals into academia where barriers were sometimes lower than in other fields like industry or government.
But not the actual scientific ideas themselves. They weren't pulling relativity out of the Torah.
That's the source's key point. Einstein was ethnically and culturally Jewish, but the theory of relativity isn't Jewish physics. The sacredness of the Torah has no inherent connections, ici.
Right.
The breakthroughs came from adopting and excelling within the framework of modern science, a framework developed largely by Gentile thinkers, relying on observation, experimentation, mathematics, not interpretation of ancient texts.
Which the source actually says was sometimes an obstacle.
Yeah, the source argues the traditional Jewish habit of seeking answers primarily in ancient texts was actually a significant obstacle to embracing the empirical methods of modern science.
And the Nobel statistics seem to back that up.
The source points out that specific statistic. Between 1905 and 1933, 10 secular German Jews won science Nobel Prizes, while 0 ultra-Orthodox Jews from traditional communities in, say, Bulgaria or Yemen did.
That correlation is pretty stark.
It strongly suggests that integration into secular learning and the modern scientific worldview, rather than adherence to traditional religious practice, was the key factor in that scientific success.
So the immense scientific contributions came from individuals who, while ethnically Jewish, were largely operating within a secularized modern scientific framework. They weren't generating that science from traditional Jewish religious or cultural ideas per se.
That's the argument presented quite clearly in the source, yes. For science, at least. It suggests the humanities and social sciences, like Freud, might be a bit different, but even there, the discontinuities with tradition are stark.
Okay. This brings us full circle, really, back to the theme of humility in the big picture. After looking at these claims and contributions, what's the author's overall takeaway? Especially regarding Judaism, but also more broadly for all cultures.
His position boils down to this. Judaism historically wasn't a particularly evil religion, but it also wasn't particularly central or important in the grand sweep of human history, at least not until the last few centuries.
So, kind of average.
For much of its existence, it was the humble religion of a small, often persecuted minority focused inward. Significant for its adherents, certainly, but not a major shaper of global events compared to some others.
So, those widespread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the world.
And the internal Jewish belief, among some, in their own unique supreme importance. The source calls both views equally ludicrous, just completely detached from historical reality.
Yeah.
Compared to the handful of religions that have profoundly shaped billions of lives globally, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, maybe Hinduism, the vast majority of creeds throughout history, including Yoruba, Bon, Shinto, and yes, Judaism, had a far more limited impact on the overall human story.
The author even offers a personal reflection on this.
Yes, saying he prefers to think he descends from historically insignificant people who mostly minded their own business and didn't impose themselves too much on others, rather than descending from brutal conquerors who reshaped the world through violence.
It loops back to that core theme then, the contrast between personal humility and collective arrogance.
Exactly. Many religions preach personal humility, urging individuals to be modest, but then they simultaneously exhibit this blatant collective arrogance about the supreme importance of their own group, their own history, their own divine favor.
And the final call from the source seems to be for taking humility much more seriously on that collective level.
Yes, for humans of all creeds, all nations, all cultures, to cultivate humility, especially humility before something larger than ourselves, whether you call it God, the universe, truth, whatever.
But with a crucial caveat.
A crucial caveat. This humility shouldn't then be twisted and used as an excuse to dominate or persecute others in the name of that higher power or that group identity. Humility needs to be genuine across the board.
That's a really powerful and, frankly, challenging conclusion. It forces us, doesn't it, to confront not just historical facts, but our own ingrained tribal egos and how they distort our understanding of the past and the present.
It encourages us to look beyond our own comforting cultural narratives and appreciate the vast, interconnected, and much older story of humanity, and to recognize that our individual group's place in it is likely far more modest than our ego often wants us to believe.
So after looking at how different cultures claim their place at the center of history and considering where our ethics and knowledge really come from, maybe the deepest dive is the one we take into our own collective ego.
Mhm.
What does truly embracing humility about our culture, our history, our beliefs actually look like in practice today? That seems like the question to ponder.
A very important question.
That concludes this deep dive.